This book is built on one uncompromising idea: discipline is not a personality trait, a gift, or a feeling. It is a system you construct and enforce. The early chapters break the myth of motivation and expose why waiting to feel ready keeps people stuck. The middle chapters focus on building ruthless self-honesty, designing an environment that makes laziness difficult, and creating rules that remove daily decision fatigue. You learn how pain, pressure, deadlines, and identity shape behavior more powerfully than inspiration. The later chapters, where you are now, are about enforcement: how to act even when tired, bored, emotional, or afraid, how to recover fast after failure, and how to turn discipline into a permanent identity rather than a temporary challenge. This final phase is about ownership: no excuses, no hiding, no negotiating with weakness. Discipline begins with a truth most people spend their entire lives running from, a truth so simple and so uncomfortable that the mind instinctively tries to soften it, delay it, or explain it away. And that truth is this: no one is coming to save you, no perfect moment is arriving, and no surge of motivation is going to appear and carry you to the life you want, because the life you want is built only by what you do when you don't feel like doing anything at all. Discipline is not a personality trait reserved for the gifted, the lucky, or the naturally strong. It is a skill forged in discomfort and repetition, and the reason most people fail is not because they lack knowledge, resources, or intelligence, but because they keep waiting for their feelings to change before they act, not realizing that feelings follow action, not the other way around. And as long as you allow mood, emotion, or energy to decide your behavior, you hand over control of your future to the most unstable forces inside you. This is the brutal truth about discipline. Discipline is choosing long-term self-respect over short-term comfort again and again, even when your mind screams for relief, even when quitting feels reasonable, even when nobody is watching, and especially when no reward is guaranteed. Because discipline does not begin in inspiration, it begins in responsibility. The moment you accept that every result in your life is connected to a pattern of choices you've been repeating, and that if you want different results, you must become someone who acts differently regardless of how it feels. Most people know what they should do, but knowledge without execution is useless, and execution without consistency is just entertainment for the ego. So discipline becomes the bridge between intention and outcome, the quiet force that turns plans into reality. Understand this clearly: your mind will lie to you to protect comfort. It will tell you to start tomorrow, to rest longer, to wait until conditions improve. But these lies feel reasonable only because they are familiar, and familiarity is not truth, it is habit, and habits shape identity, which is why discipline is not about forcing yourself once, but about creating proof through repeated action that you are someone who does what must be done. This chapter is not meant to motivate you, because motivation fades. This chapter is meant to wake you up, to strip away excuses, and to confront you with the responsibility you cannot escape. Every time you choose comfort over discipline, you reinforce weakness. And every time you choose discipline over comfort, you build strength. And those choices compound quietly over time until one day you wake up living a life you either respect or regret. Discipline is uncomfortable by design because growth requires friction, pressure, and resistance. And if it were easy, everyone would be extraordinary. But they are not, because most people quit the moment effort becomes inconvenient. Real discipline is not loud or dramatic. It does not require confidence or clarity. It only requires decision followed by action, repeated daily without negotiation. And once you understand that discipline is not punishment but freedom, the freedom to trust yourself, to rely on your word, to move forward even when fear, doubt, and fatigue are present, you begin to see that discipline is not something you do. It is something you practice until it becomes who you are. And the moment you stop waiting to feel ready and start acting anyway is the moment your life begins to change. CTR2, Motivation is the most seductive trap ever sold to people who want to change their lives, because it feels powerful, emotional, and convincing in the moment, yet disappears the instant discomfort arrives, and this is why so many people start strong and quit quietly, believing the lie that once motivation fades, something is wrong, when in reality nothing is wrong at all except their understanding of how progress actually works. Motivation is not a foundation, it is a spark, and sparks are useless without fuel, structure, and discipline to keep the fire alive. Yet most people build their entire self-improvement journey on the hope that they will feel like it tomorrow, next week, or after one more delay, not realizing that motivation is reactive, not reliable, and it shows up after action far more often than before it. Disciplined people do not wait for motivation because they understand a truth that most avoid. If you require motivation to act, you have already surrendered control of your behavior to emotion, and emotions are unstable, unpredictable, and easily manipulated by comfort, fear, and fatigue. The disciplined mind operates differently. It does not ask how it feels, it asks what must be done, and then it moves, not aggressively, not heroically, but consistently, because consistency outperforms intensity every time. Motivation loves excitement and novelty, but discipline thrives in repetition and boredom is where most people quit, because boredom exposes commitment without emotional reward. This is why motivation feels good but produces little, while discipline often feels dull but creates everything. Understand this deeply. Motivation is a side effect of progress, not the cause of it. And when you reverse that relationship, when you act first and allow motivation to follow, you break free from the endless cycle of starting and stopping that keeps most people stuck for years. Your brain is wired to avoid discomfort and seek pleasure, so it will constantly look for reasons to delay action, and motivation gives it permission to do so by saying, "Wait until you feel ready." But readiness is an illusion created by fear wearing a reasonable mask. Disciplined action does not require readiness, clarity, confidence, or certainty. It only requires a decision to move forward despite their absence. This chapter exists to dismantle the fantasy that successful people are always motivated, because they are not. They are simply committed, and commitment is what carries you through days when motivation is nowhere to be found. When you rely on motivation, your progress becomes fragile, dependent on sleep, mood, praise, and external validation. But when you rely on discipline, your progress becomes inevitable, because it no longer depends on how the day feels, only on whether you honor your standard. Motivation asks, "Do I feel like doing this?" Discipline states, "This is what I do." And that difference changes everything. The moment you stop chasing motivation and start building systems, rules, and routines that operate regardless of emotion, you gain momentum. And momentum is far more powerful than motivation because it feeds itself through action and results. Small disciplined actions performed daily create evidence, and evidence builds belief, and belief fuels motivation naturally, without force or hype. Most people try to reverse this order, trying to believe before they act, trying to feel confident before they move, trying to feel motivated before they start, and they fail not because they are weak, but because they are waiting for permission from their emotions, which will never arrive on command. Discipline is not about being hard on yourself. It is about being honest with yourself, about accepting that if you only act when it feels good, you will only live a life defined by comfort, not growth. Motivation is optional, discipline is mandatory, and once you internalize that, you stop being surprised by difficulty and start expecting it, which removes its power over you. This chapter marks a turning point, because once you stop worshipping motivation, you stop being disappointed by its absence, and instead of asking why you don't feel like doing the work, you simply do the work, knowing that feelings will catch up later, and often they do. Freedom does not come from waiting for the perfect emotional state. It comes from acting in imperfect ones, and when you finally stop using motivation as an excuse and discipline as a last resort, You begin to experience a quiet strength that does not depend on hype, inspiration, or external encouragement, but on the unshakable knowledge that no matter how you feel, you will move forward anyway. TR30. Your feelings are not facts. Yet most people allow them to run their entire lives as if they were unbreakable laws, and this silent surrender is one of the greatest reasons discipline never takes root, because feelings are temporary, inconsistent, and heavily influenced by comfort, fear, and habit, while progress demands stability and repetition. This chapter exists to break the dangerous belief that you must feel ready, confident, calm, or inspired before you act, because the truth is that feelings are reactions, not commands, and when you obey them without question, you place your future in the hands of the most unreliable system inside you. Emotions rise and fall based on sleep, food, stress, praise, criticism, and countless variables outside your control, so if action depends on feeling, consistency becomes impossible, and inconsistency slowly destroys self-trust, which is why so many people start doubting themselves, not because they are incapable, but because they keep making promises to themselves that their emotions later cancel. Disciplined individuals understand something different. They acknowledge feelings without obeying them. They feel fear and move forward, feel tired and still show up, feel bored and continue anyway, because discipline is not emotional suppression, it is emotional separation, the ability to experience feelings without allowing them to dictate behavior. The mind will often say, "I don't feel like it," but what it really means is, "This is uncomfortable," and discomfort is not danger, it is simply the sensation of growth. Yet the brain treats discomfort as a threat because it prefers familiar patterns, even if those patterns produce regret. When you stop trusting feelings as decision makers and start treating them as background noise, your behavior becomes stable, and stability is the foundation of discipline. Most people confuse listening to their feelings with respecting themselves, but true self-respect is not giving in to every emotional impulse. It is honoring the commitments you made when you were thinking clearly. Discipline requires you to act based on values, not moods, because moods change hourly while values remain, and when values guide action, discipline becomes possible even in chaos. This chapter challenges you to stop asking, "How do I feel?" and start asking, "What did I decide?" Because decisions made in advance protect you from emotional sabotage in the moment. Feelings are persuasive, they can sound logical, urgent, and convincing, especially when they argue for comfort, delay, or escape. But just because a feeling feels real does not mean it deserves obedience, and learning this distinction is one of the most powerful mental shifts you can make. When you act despite negative emotion, you send a signal to your mind that you are in control, and that signal builds confidence faster than any motivational speech ever could. Confidence is not built by feeling good before action. It is built by acting competently despite feeling bad, and each time you do this, you weaken the authority your emotions have over you. Discipline is not about becoming emotionless, it is about becoming unshakable, and there is a difference. You can feel anxious and still take the step, feel overwhelmed and still do the task, feel unmotivated and still complete the work, and every time you do, you create evidence that feelings do not define you. The longer you allow feelings to excuse inaction, the stronger their control becomes, until eventually your life is shaped by avoidance rather than intention. But the moment you stop trusting feelings as leaders and start using them as information, everything changes. This chapter is about reclaiming authority over your actions, about realizing that you don't need to win an emotional battle to move forward. You only need to refuse to let emotions veto your discipline. Feelings will come and go, but discipline is built when action remains steady through both, and once you experience the freedom of acting without emotional permission, you will never want to go back to a life where every step forward requires you to feel good first, because real power begins when you act anyway. SDR4s. Discipline becomes real the moment you stop relying on willpower and start living by non-negotiable rules. Because willpower is emotional, fragile, and quickly exhausted, while rules remove choice altogether, and choice is where most discipline collapses. Every time you debate whether to act, you drain mental energy, and every drained decision makes the next one weaker, which is why people feel burned out before they've even done meaningful work, not realizing the exhaustion comes from constant negotiation with themselves. Non-negotiable rules exist to protect you from that internal chaos. They are decisions made once and enforced daily, regardless of mood, energy, or circumstance. And when rules are clear, discipline stops feeling like force and starts functioning like structure. Most people fail at discipline because their standards are flexible, and flexible standards bend under pressure. But rigid rules create stability, and stability creates progress. A rule does not ask how you feel, it tells you what happens next. And when you follow rules consistently, you eliminate excuses before they even form. Consider how powerful this is when you say, "I work out 4 days a week no matter what," or "I start my work at the same time every morning," or "I do the hardest task first." You are no longer depending on motivation, you are depending on identity. Because rules shape who you become, the mind resists rules at first because rules feel restrictive. But the truth is the opposite. Rules create freedom by removing indecision, anxiety, and regret. Without rules, your life is run by impulses, cravings, and emotional fluctuations. But with rules, your life is guided by intention. This chapter forces you to understand that discipline is not about being harsh. It is about being clear, because unclear expectations lead to broken promises, and broken promises destroy self-trust. When you break a rule, the damage is not the missed action. It is the signal you send to yourself that your word is negotiable. And once your word loses authority, discipline becomes impossible. This is why disciplined people protect their rules fiercely, not because they are rigid, but because they understand that self-respect is built on consistency. Non-negotiable rules must be simple, specific, and enforceable, because vague rules create loopholes, and loopholes invite excuses. "I'll try my best" is not a rule. "I don't skip my scheduled work" is. Rules should be designed to eliminate decision-making in moments of weakness, because weakness is predictable, and discipline is preparation for predictable weakness, not denial of it. The disciplined person does not hope they will be strong tomorrow. They assume they will be tempted and plan accordingly. This is why rules outperform goals. Goals are future, focused, and emotional, while rules operate in the present and demand action. You don't need to feel inspired to follow a rule. You only need to obey it. And obedience creates momentum. Many people fear that rules will make life boring, but boredom is not the enemy, inconsistency is, because boredom still produces results, while inconsistency produces frustration. Rules create rhythm, and rhythm creates progress. Once rules are established, discipline becomes automatic, because the brain no longer wastes energy deciding what to do. It simply executes. This chapter also exposes a hard truth. If you keep breaking your own rules, the problem is not discipline, it is honesty. Because rules only work when you stop lying to yourself about what you are willing to enforce. A rule you don't enforce is not a rule, it is a suggestion, and suggestions collapse under pressure. Discipline requires consequences, even small ones, because consequences teach the brain that standards matter. When you live by non-negotiable rules, your life becomes predictable in the best way. You show up, you execute, you improve, not because you feel powerful, but because your system is stronger than your emotions. Over time, rules shape identity, and identity reinforces discipline, creating a loop that no longer requires force. You stop asking whether you should act, and start asking whether you will honor who you say you are. This is the moment discipline stops being a daily battle and starts becoming a daily practice, because rules remove chaos and replace it with order, and order is the foundation of every disciplined life. When rules are clear, excuses disappear, action becomes inevitable, and progress stops being optional, and that is the true power of non-negotiable rules. Most people believe discipline is something that must come entirely from inside, a constant battle of willpower against temptation. But this belief is exactly why they keep failing, because willpower is limited while environment is relentless, and the truth is that your surroundings shape your behavior far more than your intentions ever will. This chapter forces you to confront a reality you may have been ignoring. If your environment is designed for comfort, distraction, and ease, then discipline will always feel like suffering. But if your environment is designed for focus, pressure, and clarity, discipline becomes the natural outcome. Every object you see, every app you open, every sound you hear is either pushing you toward action or pulling you toward avoidance, and pretending you can just be strong in a weak environment is another form of hiding. Disciplined people do not rely on self-control alone. They remove temptation, reduce friction for good habits, and increase friction for bad ones, because behavior follows the path of least resistance. When distractions are easy and productive actions are hard, you will choose distraction, not because you are lazy, but because you are human. This is why changing your environment is not cheating, it is strategy. Discipline is not about proving strength, it is about eliminating unnecessary battles. If your phone is always within reach, if notifications are always on, if comfort is always available, your brain will constantly seek escape, and each escape reinforces the habit of avoidance. This chapter teaches you to stop fighting temptation and start designing it out of your life by making bad habits inconvenient and good habits unavoidable. Simple changes, like keeping your workspace clean, setting clear start times, using tools that block distractions, or placing reminders where you cannot ignore them, have a powerful psychological effect because they remove decision points, and every removed decision strengthens discipline. Environment also includes people, and the people around you either normalize discipline or normalize excuses, and you become like what you tolerate. If everyone around you avoids effort, mocks consistency, or glorifies comfort, discipline will feel lonely and unnatural. But if your environment supports effort and growth, discipline becomes normal. This chapter challenges you to stop asking why you lack discipline and start asking what your environment is training you to do. Because your habits are not random, they are responses to cues around you. Disciplined individuals understand that pressure is not the enemy, it is a tool, and they intentionally create deadlines, accountability, and structure that force action even when motivation is low. Pressure removes the option to delay, and when delay disappears, action follows. This is why people often perform better under external deadlines than self-imposed ones, and this chapter teaches you how to recreate that pressure for yourself through systems, not feelings. Your environment should tell you what to do without you having to think about it, because thinking invites negotiation, and negotiation kills discipline. When your environment is aligned with your goals, effort feels lighter not because the work is easier, but because resistance has been reduced. This chapter also reveals a hard truth. If you refuse to change your environment, you are choosing to rely on willpower, and willpower eventually fails. Disciplined people accept that they are not above temptation, so they design systems that protect them from themselves. Environment is discipline made visible. It is your future self helping your present self do the right thing. Once you start shaping your surroundings intentionally, you stop blaming yourself for inconsistency and start seeing progress as predictable. Discipline becomes less about fighting urges and more about following the path already laid out for you. This chapter marks a major shift, because when you stop trying to be disciplined in an undisciplined environment, you stop exhausting yourself, and when your environment supports your standards, discipline stops feeling like force and starts feeling like alignment. The strongest form of discipline is not internal struggle, it is external design, and once you master this, consistency is no longer heroic, it is automatic. As CR6 size, pain is the price of growth, yet most people spend their lives trying to avoid it, not realizing that avoidance is exactly what keeps them weak, stuck, and frustrated. because discipline is not built in comfort, it is forged in discomfort, pressure, and resistance. This chapter exists to dismantle the illusion that progress should feel good, easy, or smooth, because the truth is that every meaningful change in your life will demand that you do things you would rather not do, repeatedly, without immediate reward. And the faster you accept this, the faster discipline becomes possible. Pain is not a sign that something is wrong, it is a signal that something is changing. Yet the undisciplined mind interprets discomfort as danger and immediately looks for escape, rest, distraction, or justification to stop, while the disciplined mind learns to sit inside discomfort without running from it. Most people quit not because they are incapable, but because they misinterpret pain, believing that struggle means failure, when in reality struggle is proof that you are doing something that matters. This chapter reframes pain as a teacher, not an enemy, because pain reveals limits, exposes weaknesses, and demands adaptation, and without it, growth would be impossible. Discipline requires you to choose one type of pain over another, the temporary pain of effort or the permanent pain of regret. And while effort hurts now, regret corrodes slowly and silently over time. Every time you avoid pain today, you postpone it to tomorrow with interest. And this is why comfort is so expensive. Disciplined people understand that pain is unavoidable, so they choose the pain that leads somewhere instead of the pain that leaves them stuck. This chapter challenges you to stop asking how to avoid discomfort and start asking how to endure it productively, because endurance is a skill, not a talent, and like any skill, it is developed through exposure. The more often you face discomfort and survive it, the less power it has over you, and eventually, what once felt unbearable becomes manageable. Then normal. Pain loses its authority when you stop treating it as a signal to quit. Discipline grows when you learn to stay present in discomfort without dramatizing it, without attaching stories to it, without convincing yourself that you are broken or incapable. The mind loves to exaggerate pain, turning temporary difficulty into permanent identity. But disciplined individuals interrupt this narrative by focusing on action instead of sensation. This chapter also exposes the comfort trap, the belief that life should feel good most of the time, which is a modern illusion that produces weakness, because growth has never been comfortable, and expecting comfort while demanding progress is a contradiction. Discipline demands that you respect pain as part of the process, not something to be eliminated. When you stop trying to numb discomfort with distractions, excuses, or shortcuts, you begin to build resilience, and resilience is what allows discipline to last. Pain handled correctly strengthens you, pain avoided weakens you, and pain misunderstood confuses you, which is why so many people cycle between bursts of effort and long periods of avoidance. This chapter teaches you to normalize effort, to stop being surprised by difficulty, and to understand that discipline is not supposed to feel pleasant, it is supposed to be effective. When you expect pain, it loses the power to shock you into quitting. When you plan for discomfort, you stop panicking when it arrives. Disciplined people do not love pain, they respect it, because they know it is shaping them into someone stronger than their excuses. This chapter is about developing a higher tolerance for effort, boredom, and resistance, not through toughness alone, but through understanding. Once you realize that pain is the entry fee for any life worth living, you stop negotiating with it and start moving through it. Discipline is not the absence of pain, it is the willingness to carry it without dropping your standards. And when you master this, discomfort no longer controls your actions, it sharpens them, and that is the moment growth becomes inevitable. Discipline is not built through effort alone, it is built through identity, because the person you believe yourself to be determines the actions you take, the standards you enforce, and the consistency you maintain. And yet most people operate as if identity is irrelevant, constantly trying to change behavior without changing who they think they are, which is why so many fail despite knowledge, motivation, or occasional bursts of willpower. This chapter exists to shift your understanding from, "I want to do this," to, "I am the type of person who does this," because behavior aligned with identity is automatic, effortless in the sense that it no longer requires negotiation and resistant to excuses, while behavior misaligned with identity is fragile, temporary, and easily derailed. The mind is wired to act in accordance with the stories it believes about you, and if you see yourself as inconsistent, lazy, or incapable, your brain will treat any effort as an exception rather than the rule, and exceptions never last. Identity-based discipline begins with self-honesty, acknowledging who you are today without judgment, and then intentionally deciding who you want to become, because only with clarity about your identity can you create rules, habits, and behaviors that reinforce it rather than fight against it. Most people try to motivate themselves to act in ways that contradict their self-perception, which is why motivation often fails. But when you shift your internal narrative, motivation is no longer required, because your actions are congruent with who you believe yourself to be. This chapter challenges you to stop saying, "I will try," and start saying, "I am the type of person who does not quit, who shows up, who prioritizes growth over comfort," because words and beliefs create cognitive pathways that the body and mind follow automatically over time. Identity shapes decisions in the moment, and momentary decisions compound into habits, which compound into character, and eventually your character determines your results. Yet most people try to skip straight to results without aligning their identity first, and that shortcut always fails. Disciplined people understand that external pressure, motivation, or incentive is secondary to internal belief, because the person who sees themselves as reliable, consistent, and capable will act even when no one is watching, even when progress is slow, and even when life is uncomfortable. This chapter also highlights the power of repetition in reinforcing identity. Every time you act in alignment with the person you want to be, you are telling your brain a story about who you are, and each repetition strengthens that story until it becomes automatic, which is why small actions matter as much as large ones. Identity-based discipline eliminates the mental debate that kills most efforts, because your question is no longer, "Should I do this?" but "Is this who I am?" And the answer directs behavior without negotiation. The undisciplined mind separates effort from identity, making action optional and consistency impossible. But when you internalize identity, effort becomes natural, and discipline becomes habitual. This chapter forces you to consider that if your actions are not reinforcing your identity, they are working against it, and the most common reason for failure is acting inconsistently with the person you believe yourself to be. True identity-based discipline does not rely on external validation, reward, or recognition, because the reward is alignment with self and integrity, and when you live this way, showing up becomes inevitable, because failure is no longer merely a missed goal, it is a mismatch with who you say you are, and identity is far more persuasive than any external consequence. This chapter also teaches that identity is not fixed. It can be chosen, molded, and strengthened, but only through repeated action, deliberate practice, and refusal to accept excuses. Every time you act against temporary feelings and in alignment with your chosen identity, you build trust with yourself, and self-trust is the foundation of all lasting discipline. The moment you realize that being disciplined is not about acting occasionally or in spurts, but about embodying the values, beliefs, and standards of the person you aspire to be, you stop relying on motivation, mood, or external conditions, and you start living in a way that makes consistent progress inevitable. Because who you are now determines what you do next, and who you are becoming is reinforced with every disciplined choice you make. Identity is the silent force behind every habit, every standard, and every achievement. And when you align your actions with your self-image, discipline ceases to be a struggle. It becomes the natural outcome of living as the person you have chosen to be. TRH's consistency beats intensity every single time. Yet most people operate under the false belief that discipline is measured by how extreme, impressive, or dramatic their actions are, when in reality, lasting success is forged in repeated, steady effort, the small daily actions that often go unnoticed, because bursts of intensity without follow-through create moments of accomplishment, but no long-term change, and the human brain quickly forgets heroic efforts that are not sustained. This chapter exists to shift your focus from occasional greatness to daily commitment, because the person who acts consistently, even in small ways, compounds results over time, while the person who only acts when inspired or energized falls back to square one repeatedly, trapped in a cycle of hope and failure. Consistency is not about excitement or novelty, it is about reliability, predictability, and resilience, and it is far more powerful than any one act of willpower, because a single act does not change identity, habits, or systems, but repeated actions do, and the brain begins to adapt to the new normal through what is called neural reinforcement, creating automatic patterns that make disciplined behavior less effortful and more natural. Most people underestimate how much small, consistent actions can achieve because they are seduced by stories of dramatic breakthroughs, instant transformations, or heroic effort, not realizing that those rare outcomes are the result of decades of quiet, steady, unglamorous work that went unseen. This chapter teaches you to embrace repetition, even when it feels boring, mundane, or too easy, because boredom is the proving ground of consistency, and mastery is built in the unremarkable moments when no one is watching and no external reward is given. The disciplined individual understands that it is not the occasional fire that keeps the engine running, but the daily oiling of habits, the routine maintenance of standards, and the persistent reinforcement of identity, because consistency compounds while inconsistency erodes. One missed day may feel insignificant, but repeated inconsistency builds a pattern that undermines trust with yourself, and self-trust is the foundation of all future discipline. So honoring the simple actions daily is not trivial, it is critical. Intensity may create peaks, but consistency builds mountains, and over time, the cumulative effect of consistent action surpasses even the most spectacular one-time efforts, because life rewards those who show up repeatedly, not occasionally. This chapter also forces you to confront the discomfort of monotony, because consistent action rarely feels exciting, and without learning to respect and endure ordinary work, you will abandon progress at the first sign of boredom, believing that motivation, inspiration, or novelty should carry you, when in truth, the work itself is its own reward. Repetition is the quiet teacher that strengthens discipline, reinforces identity, and trains the mind to respond predictably under pressure, fatigue, or distraction. And it is in these repeated moments that character is built, resilience is forged, and results become inevitable. This chapter emphasizes that perfection is not required. Consistency does not demand flawless execution, it demands persistence, showing up even when energy is low, focus is shaky, or circumstances are imperfect. Because imperfect consistency beats perfect inconsistency every time, disciplined people do not wait for ideal conditions or dramatic moments. They operate under the principle that action repeated daily, no matter how small, is what separates those who achieve from those who aspire, and this understanding removes the tyranny of all or nothing thinking, which is one of the most common obstacles to sustained discipline. Consistency also reinforces identity, because each repeated action tells the mind and body who you are, strengthening the story that you are reliable, committed, and capable, and over time, these small proofs of consistency replace the need for constant motivation or external accountability. This chapter makes it clear that the path to mastery, success, or personal growth is rarely glamorous. It is quiet, persistent, and cumulative, and by honoring the power of daily repetition, you create systems that carry you forward automatically, reducing reliance on willpower, emotion, or circumstance. The disciplined person understands that intensity is tempting but fleeting, while consistency is silent but unstoppable. And when you finally internalize that showing up daily, performing the required actions consistently, and respecting the compounding power of repetition is more important than occasional heroic effort. You begin to experience the momentum that transforms effort into habit, habit into identity, and identity into results that cannot be reversed, because the accumulation of consistent action ultimately determines the trajectory of your life, far more than any single burst of motivation, energy, or inspiration ever could. Saptianensis. Excuses are the silent killers of discipline, subtle and persuasive, and most people do not even realize how much of their time, energy, and potential is squandered because they accept excuses as valid reasoning, convincing themselves that external circumstances, emotions, or limitations are responsible for their lack of action, when in reality, excuses are simply self-deception dressed in logic, and the moment you recognize this, you gain the power to stop sabotaging yourself. This chapter exists to make you confront the uncomfortable truth that every excuse you make is a choice, a decision to prioritize comfort over growth, avoidance over action, and momentary relief over long-term gain. Because an excuse is never a truth about capability, it is a refusal to act in spite of difficulty, and as long as you accept excuses, you remain powerless to change. Excuses are seductive because they feel reasonable. They often involve blaming circumstances, other people, lack of time, or insufficient resources. But reasoning and reality are not the same, and disciplined people understand that reality does not bend to opinion, feeling, or justification. It only responds to action. And each excuse you indulge is a vote against your future self, weakening your identity, eroding self-trust, and teaching your brain that inaction is acceptable. Most people lie to themselves with excuses without realizing it, and these lies accumulate into habits that define behavior, which is why so many fail to act consistently despite knowing exactly what to do, because they have created a mental narrative that excuses inaction and softens accountability, and until that narrative is broken, knowledge and motivation are useless. This chapter challenges you to examine your excuses ruthlessly and ask whether they are truth or convenience, because the disciplined mind refuses to accept convenience as a standard for action, and by doing so, you reclaim responsibility for every choice you make, every action you take, and every result you achieve. Excuses are often disguised as valid reasons, such as being tired, stressed, overwhelmed, or waiting for the perfect moment, but the disciplined person understands that the perfect moment rarely exists, that energy will fluctuate, and that circumstances will never be ideal. And action, despite these factors, is the true definition of discipline, while waiting for conditions to align is a guarantee of stagnation. Excuses also allow people to externalize failure, to blame others or the environment instead of confronting their own limitations. But this externalization prevents learning, growth, and the internalization of responsibility, which is exactly what builds lasting discipline. This chapter teaches you to stop negotiating with yourself, to stop rationalizing delay, and to start acting, because action is non-negotiable, and every time you overcome an excuse, you send a signal to your brain that you are capable, reliable, and committed, reinforcing identity and strengthening self-trust, which are far more powerful than motivation or emotion. Excuses often feel protective in the short term, shielding ego from discomfort, criticism, or failure, but in the long term they are corrosive, eroding confidence, progress, and personal power, because every unchallenged excuse compounds into larger patterns of avoidance and self-sabotage. Disciplined people learn to recognize the subtle ways excuses creep into thinking, through stories, comparisons, fears, and rationalizations, and they confront them immediately, either by acting despite them or by eliminating the underlying condition that allows the excuse to persist. This chapter also emphasizes that eliminating excuses is not about harshness or perfectionism. It is about clarity and responsibility, because the moment you stop lying to yourself, you remove a barrier that has held you back for years, and action becomes inevitable when excuses are no longer tolerated. Every great achiever, every person who has mastered discipline, has developed a zero-tolerance approach to excuses because they understand that excuses are nothing more than postponed action, delayed growth, and a slow betrayal of potential. And when you refuse to allow excuses to dictate behavior, you align your actions with intention and standards, making progress predictable and consistent. Excuses thrive in the absence of accountability, planning, and clear rules, which is why discipline systems are designed to remove the space for excuses. By establishing routines, non-negotiable standards, and environmental cues that force action, you eliminate the opportunity for rationalization, and what remains is consistent execution. This chapter makes it clear that discipline is not a struggle against difficulty, discomfort, or complexity. It is a struggle against excuses, against the mind's attempts to protect comfort at the cost of growth. And the moment you recognize this, you shift the battlefield inward, confronting every justification and replacing it with action, because action builds momentum, reinforces identity, and produces results, while excuses only produce stagnation, regret, and weakness. The most important lesson of this chapter is that excuses are voluntary, and when you take full responsibility for your choices, you reclaim control over your life, remove self-sabotage, and create the conditions for disciplined, consistent, and unstoppable progress in every area that matters. Essays aptr 10 seconds. Discipline is revealed most clearly on the days when you are tired, because everyone is motivated and consistent when energy is high, but true character and lasting progress are forged in the moments when fatigue, stress, and discomfort push you to the edge of quitting. And this chapter exists to teach you that showing up when you are exhausted is not optional if you want to build a life defined by control, self-respect, and achievement. Most people underestimate the importance of performing under low-energy conditions, believing that they need peak motivation, clarity, or vigor to act. But this belief is a trap. Because life is rarely perfect, circumstances are often inconvenient, and waiting for ideal conditions guarantees that action will be delayed indefinitely, which is why the disciplined individual learns to operate independently of energy levels, relying on rules, systems, and habit rather than temporary enthusiasm. Fatigue is not the enemy, it is a natural signal that the body and mind are being challenged, and learning to act despite it is the essence of resilience. Because every time you choose action over surrender in exhaustion, you prove to yourself that discipline is stronger than circumstance, emotion, or impulse, and that proof compounds silently into identity, confidence, and capability. Most people quit at the first sign of tiredness, thinking that pushing through is unnecessary, unsafe, or unsustainable. But the truth is that discomfort and fatigue are inevitable in any meaningful pursuit, and avoiding them is a guarantee of stagnation, mediocrity, and regret, because growth is never convenient, comfortable, or easy, and the ability to persist when energy is low is what separates those who achieve from those who merely dream. This chapter teaches that action in low-energy states is not about heroism or willpower alone. It is about preparation, strategy, and mindset. Because the disciplined person does not leave consistency to chance. They create routines, rules, and systems that carry them through moments of weakness, ensuring that even when motivation is gone, action continues uninterrupted. One of the most powerful realizations in discipline is that waiting to feel capable is an illusion, because the body and mind will never provide constant energy, clarity, or enthusiasm, and relying on them is a formula for inconsistency, while acting despite fatigue builds neural pathways that make future action easier, reinforcing habits that operate even when the mind protests. This chapter also emphasizes the importance of starting before you feel ready, because motion itself generates energy, and each step, no matter how small, creates momentum that fights back against exhaustion, inertia, and doubt, turning what initially feels impossible into manageable progress, and turning temporary discomfort into long-term strength. Discipline under fatigue requires mental toughness, but mental toughness is not innate. It is trained through repeated exposure to conditions where the body wants to quit, and the mind wants to rationalize inaction. And the more often you practice acting while tired, the less intimidating low-energy moments become, until persistence becomes a default response rather than a heroic exception. This chapter challenges you to examine the times you have allowed exhaustion to dictate your behavior, and to recognize that those moments were not caused by physical tiredness alone, but by surrendering to it without strategy, preparation, or rules. And the disciplined person eliminates that surrender by designing environments, habits, and systems that reduce the impact of fatigue, such as scheduling work at predictable times, breaking tasks into manageable segments, and automating decision-making so that the brain can act even when energy is depleted. Fatigue is often accompanied by mental resistance, negative thoughts, and a desire to delay, but disciplined individuals treat these signs not as reasons to quit, but as indicators that growth is happening, because the mind resists change, and change always feels uncomfortable, and persistence in these moments strengthens character, resilience, and identity. The lesson of this chapter is clear. If you only act when energy is high, you will achieve sporadically, but if you learn to act when energy is low, you will achieve reliably, consistently, and predictably, because discipline is not measured by bursts of performance, but by the ability to execute regardless of internal conditions, and this ability compounds over time into unstoppable momentum, unwavering confidence, and the unshakable belief that no matter what the day brings, fatigue, stress, distraction, or pressure, you will still show up and do what must be done, proving to yourself repeatedly that your standards are stronger than your feelings, and that discipline is ultimately a decision reinforced by action that no exhaustion, no setback, and no temporary weakness can overturn. C.R. Levins's discipline without rewards is the ultimate test of character, because most people act only when there is a visible payoff, a pat on the back, praise from others, or some immediate sense of satisfaction, and this is why external validation is one of the most dangerous crutches for anyone trying to build lasting habits, because when the reward disappears, so does effort, and without internal standards, consistency collapses. This chapter exists to teach you that true discipline is not dependent on recognition, outcomes, or applause. It is dependent on your willingness to act because it is the right thing to do, because it aligns with your identity, and because it is non-negotiable. And once you understand this, you gain freedom from the tyranny of external approval and the unstable highs and lows of emotional reinforcement. Humans are wired to seek reward, which is why so many people start with excitement and abandon tasks when the initial thrill fades. But disciplined individuals understand that reward is not the motivator. It is the byproduct of repeated, consistent, and principled action. And when action precedes reward, the work itself becomes the standard, and the outcome becomes secondary, predictable, and inevitable over time. This chapter challenges the misconception that effort must feel rewarding to be sustainable, because reward-seeking creates dependence on circumstances outside your control, on praise from others, or on immediate results, all of which are unreliable and temporary, and instead, it teaches you to internalize standards so that effort is carried out consistently regardless of emotional payoff, because identity, self-respect, and long-term vision are far more powerful motivators than fleeting pleasure. Discipline without rewards requires mental toughness, but mental toughness is not about ignoring pleasure. It is about redefining the source of motivation, from external signals to internal standards, and from short-term gratification to long-term self-respect. And once this shift occurs, showing up becomes non-negotiable, not because it feels good, but because it is the action of the person you have chosen to become. Most people confuse enjoyment with purpose, and when work feels unpleasant, they quit, assuming that a meaningful life should always feel exciting. But the disciplined person understands that growth is rarely pleasurable in the moment, and that satisfaction often comes later, as a byproduct of effort consistently applied, and that the struggle itself is the evidence of progress. This chapter emphasizes that relying on reward creates fragile discipline because rewards are unpredictable, delayed, or insufficient, whereas acting because you have committed to a standard, a principle, or an identity creates unshakable discipline because action is no longer contingent on conditions. It is inevitable, automatic, and self-reinforcing, and each completed action without external reward strengthens internal authority and self-trust. The most reliable currency for long-term achievement, discipline without rewards also trains patience, because the immediate sense of gratification is removed, and the focus shifts to process, consistency, and integrity. And when you develop this mindset, you stop seeking short-term pleasure as proof of progress and start using effort itself as the metric of success, knowing that results are secondary and will arrive naturally if you persist. This chapter teaches that when you stop seeking reward, you free yourself from distraction, comparison, and envy, because your actions are no longer dictated by outcomes, others' approval, or social validation, and instead they are dictated by your own standards, your own identity, and your own commitment. And this internal locus of control is the cornerstone of unstoppable discipline. Acting without reward also cultivates humility, because you learn to value effort over recognition, contribution over applause, and character over popularity. And over time, this perspective produces a deep and resilient confidence, one that is impervious to praise, criticism, or temporary setbacks. Because the validation comes from alignment with your own standards rather than the approval of others, most people underestimate the freedom and power that comes from this mindset, because they are trapped in the illusion that action must feel good or be celebrated to matter. But the disciplined person knows that the real proof of growth is in showing up day after day, completing the work, and maintaining standards even when no one notices, because over time, the accumulation of these actions produces mastery, results, and a life of integrity that no external reward could ever replicate. This chapter is about internalizing authority over your own actions, about replacing reward, seeking with standard honoring, and about learning that discipline is not about feeling good, achieving recognition, or gaining approval. It is about acting consistently, intentionally, and uncompromisingly in alignment with who you are and who you want to become. And when you adopt this principle, you become unstoppable, because your actions no longer require conditions, circumstances, or emotional highs. They require only your commitment, your identity, and your refusal to compromise. And that is the essence of discipline without rewards. As CAPTR 12, recovering fast after failure is one of the most critical skills in building discipline, yet it is often overlooked, because most people respond to failure with hesitation, regret, self-criticism, or avoidance, and these reactions compound the setback rather than resolve it, keeping them trapped in cycles of disappointment, guilt, and inaction. And this chapter exists to teach you how to respond differently, with speed, clarity, and purpose, because the way you handle failure determines the trajectory of your growth far more than failure itself. Failure is inevitable in any meaningful pursuit because growth requires action beyond your current capabilities, pushing boundaries, and venturing into uncertainty. And the disciplined person understands that failure is not a permanent condition, but a temporary signal, feedback that informs what needs adjustment, improvement, or repetition. And the faster you respond, the faster you reclaim momentum, confidence, and progress. Most people treat failure as a verdict rather than feedback, letting it define their identity, color their perception of ability, and dictate future decisions. But the disciplined individual reframes failure as information, separating the outcome from the self, because discipline is built on persistence, adaptability, and the refusal to let temporary setbacks determine permanent results. Recovering fast requires emotional control, because the natural response to failure is frustration, shame, or self-doubt. But these emotions, if indulged, delay action, erode self-trust, and weaken standards, while disciplined recovery channels emotion into analysis, learning, and immediate corrective action, transforming what could be a stumbling block into a stepping stone. This chapter teaches that speed is essential, because the longer you dwell on failure, the more it accumulates, creating inertia, fear, and hesitation, and the longer momentum is lost, the harder it is to regain, whereas fast recovery neutralizes the impact, restores confidence, and re-establishes the habit of action, ensuring that standards are maintained even in adversity. Disciplined recovery also involves removing blame, rationalizing excuses, or externalizing responsibility, because these behaviors prevent true learning and perpetuate avoidance, whereas acknowledging your role in outcomes, analyzing decisions, and adjusting systems, strategies, or actions creates ownership, and ownership is the fuel of resilience, accountability, and long-term discipline. Most people underestimate the compounding effect of delayed recovery, not realizing that repeated failures combined with slow or insufficient response erode self-efficacy, reinforce fear, and condition the mind to anticipate failure as catastrophic, while the disciplined individual treats each setback as a controlled experiment, a data point, and a chance to strengthen mental toughness and operational skills, which over time builds unshakable confidence and consistency. Recovering fast also requires a focus on action rather than emotion, because action transforms uncertainty into clarity, doubt into learning, and regret into forward momentum, and disciplined people prioritize what must be done next, not what happened, because dwelling on what cannot be changed diverts energy away from the areas where they can make an impact, and energy is the most valuable resource in building discipline. This chapter emphasizes that speed does not mean recklessness, because thoughtful reflection, analysis, and adjustment are part of disciplined recovery, but it does mean refusing to stay immobilized, to procrastinate, or to ruminate, because hesitation turns minor failures into major derailments, and disciplined recovery neutralizes this threat by re-establishing control quickly. Failure is also inevitable in complex, high-stakes or growth-oriented environments, and accepting that reality is a critical mindset shift, because those who fear failure avoid risk, underperform, and remain stagnant, whereas those who understand that failure is simply part of the process embrace action, tolerate discomfort, and develop the mental resilience to recover, adapt, and persist, knowing that long-term results depend on their ability to maintain standards despite temporary setbacks. This chapter also teaches practical methods for fast recovery, including breaking down what went wrong, identifying immediate corrective steps, executing those steps without delay, and reinforcing positive habits to prevent recurrence. Because recovery without action is merely reflection, which does not build discipline, self-trust, or momentum. The disciplined person does not allow failure to define them, derail them, or demoralize them, because identity, standards, and consistency are stronger than any temporary outcome, and by acting immediately, learning quickly, and moving forward decisively, they transform every failure into an opportunity for growth, improvement, and reinforcement of self-respect. In essence, fast recovery is a mindset and a skill, a combination of emotional control, analytical clarity, decisive action, and unwavering commitment to standards, and mastering this skill ensures that no setback, mistake, or obstacle has the power to permanently derail progress, because discipline is not the absence of failure, it is the ability to rise quickly, correct course, and continue acting with consistency, integrity, and purpose. And when you internalize this principle, you stop fearing failure and start seeing it as the fuel that strengthens resilience, sharpens judgment, and accelerates the development of an unstoppable, disciplined life. Chapter 13, sacrificing short-term pleasure for long-term gain is the cornerstone of discipline, yet it is one of the hardest lessons to internalize, because human nature is wired to seek comfort, avoid discomfort, and respond immediately to rewards, and most people allow these instincts to dictate their behavior, which is why they drift through life chasing fleeting enjoyment while neglecting meaningful growth, delayed results, and the foundations of lasting achievement. This chapter exists to illuminate the critical truth that every moment of indulgence comes at the expense of future potential, and every choice to prioritize comfort over effort reinforces weakness, habitually reshapes identity, and subtly erodes self-trust, so that over time, a life built on short-term gratification becomes a life of frustration, regret, and untapped capability, while the person who consistently sacrifices immediate pleasure for long-term benefit develops resilience, mental toughness, and the compounding advantage of sustained effort. Understanding this principle requires a shift in perspective, from seeking immediate emotional reward to embracing delayed fulfillment, from asking, "What feels good right now?" to asking, "What will move me closer to the person I want to become?" Because every action has a cost, and discipline is fundamentally about choosing the cost that produces value rather than the cost that delivers only temporary relief. Most people underestimate the cumulative power of small sacrifices, believing that discipline is built solely through grand gestures, extreme effort, or monumental decisions, but in reality, it is the accumulation of small, consistent decisions to forego comfort, resist distraction, and prioritize meaningful work over immediate gratification that compounds into significant advantage, shaping identity, habits, and outcomes over time, and creating a life defined by achievement rather than regret. This chapter emphasizes that pleasure is not inherently bad, nor should life be a constant struggle, but uncontrolled indulgence, habitual avoidance of effort, and prioritization of short-term satisfaction over long-term goals are the hidden forces that undermine potential, erode self-discipline, and keep the majority of people stuck in cycles of mediocrity, chasing fleeting highs while abandoning the actions necessary to achieve enduring success. The disciplined person understands that sacrifice is not punishment, it is investment, and every moment of discomfort endured, every urge resisted, and every step taken toward long-term objectives strengthens identity, reinforces self-trust, and builds the momentum required to accomplish meaningful goals, because life rewards consistent investment more than occasional bursts of effort, and delayed gratification is not deprivation, it is a tool for compounding personal and professional growth. This chapter also explores the psychological mechanisms behind indulgence, explaining how the brain perceives immediate pleasure as urgent and essential, while long-term benefits feel abstract and distant, and how discipline requires consciously overriding these instinctual impulses by focusing on process, identity, and the future consequences of today's choices, which is why building systems, rules, and routines that enforce delayed gratification is critical for anyone who wants to live intentionally rather than reactively. Short-term sacrifice also teaches mastery over desire, because the more often you resist temptation, defer comfort, and prioritize effort over ease, the more control you gain over your impulses, and the less power temporary pleasure has over your decisions, creating freedom not through indulgence but through choice, autonomy, and self-respect, and this freedom compounds as identity, habits, and results align with deliberate, disciplined action. This chapter challenges the misconception that discipline requires heroism or constant struggle, clarifying that discipline is not about being harsh, punitive, or joyless, but about making conscious choices that prioritize value over instant gratification, aligning actions with long-term objectives, and recognizing that the discomfort of sacrifice is temporary, whereas the benefits of consistent, deliberate action endure. Understanding and practicing this principle transforms behavior, because the brain learns that fulfillment is found not in transient pleasure, but in meaningful progress, in growth achieved through effort, and in self-trust reinforced by repeated choices to act in accordance with higher standards. Those who master the art of sacrificing short-term pleasure develop patience, resilience, and foresight, as well as the ability to defer impulses without guilt or self-judgment, knowing that each small choice compounds into larger results, shaping identity, capability, and life trajectory. This chapter reinforces that life is a series of choices, and every choice to prioritize effort over ease, growth over comfort, And long-term results over immediate gratification is an investment in the person you are becoming, because self-discipline is not a temporary state but a skill, an identity, and a habitual way of interacting with the world, and the consistent application of this principle transforms ordinary action into extraordinary results, temporary sacrifice into lasting advantage, and everyday decisions into the foundation of a life defined by achievement, self-respect, and unshakable discipline, demonstrating that the path to success is paved not with pleasure, but with intentional, consistent, and courageous choices to prioritize long-term value above fleeting comfort. The Sech Aptiar 14's discipline is not built in isolation, it is reinforced through accountability, because no matter how motivated, committed, or self-aware you are, the human mind naturally seeks shortcuts, rationalizations, and excuses, and without external or internal accountability, even the strongest intentions can falter under pressure, fatigue, or distraction, which is why this chapter exists, to teach you the critical role accountability plays in sustaining discipline, building consistency, and creating an environment where standards are not negotiable and actions are tracked, observed, and reinforced, whether by others or through structured self-monitoring. Accountability works because it creates stakes, and stakes change behavior by making inaction or failure uncomfortable, not in a punitive sense, but as a natural consequence of transparency, trust, and commitment. And disciplined individuals understand that accountability is not a threat to independence, but a tool that amplifies consistency, strengthens habits, and reinforces identity by connecting actions to tangible, visible outcomes. Most people underestimate accountability because they think discipline is a purely internal battle, but the truth is that self-monitoring alone is often insufficient, because the mind is prone to excuse-making, delay, and self-deception, and without feedback loops or external checks, it is easy to rationalize missed actions, adjust standards downward, or postpone commitments indefinitely, eroding self-trust and creating a cycle of inconsistency, frustration, and stagnation. This chapter teaches that accountability can take many forms, from mentors, coaches, and peers who observe, critique, and support your progress, to systems like journals, logs, or checklists that record performance, to public commitments that create social stakes. But the underlying principle is the same. When your behavior is visible, tracked, and evaluated, it becomes more likely to align with your stated standards and intentions, because humans are wired to respond to observation and consequence, and disciplined people leverage this natural tendency to maintain consistency even when motivation is low or circumstances are challenging. Accountability is not about fear or punishment, it is about clarity and reinforcement, because when you see progress, gaps, or patterns in your actions, you gain insight into strengths, weaknesses, and areas for improvement, and this self-awareness strengthens identity, reinforces rules, and builds confidence, creating a feedback loop that sustains disciplined behavior over time, while neglecting accountability leaves you blind to patterns, susceptible to rationalization, and dependent solely on willpower and fleeting motivation. This chapter also emphasizes that accountability requires honesty, because systems, peers, or tools are only effective if you report accurately, reflect sincerely, and act with integrity. And without this honesty, accountability becomes a false measure, a superficial layer that cannot influence behavior or reinforce self-trust, which is why the disciplined person cultivates transparency, openness, and responsibility, recognizing that true accountability begins with themselves before it extends outward. Integrating accountability into daily routines strengthens resilience because it removes ambiguity, reduces negotiation with self, and creates predictable consequences that reinforce the habit loop. And it prevents small lapses from becoming patterns of failure, because each instance of measured feedback allows immediate correction, adjustment, and recommitment, ensuring that standards are maintained even under pressure, fatigue, or distraction. Most people avoid accountability because it feels exposing, uncomfortable, or vulnerable, but disciplined individuals embrace it because it accelerates growth, strengthens self-discipline, and turns intention into action, transforming potential into results and mistakes into learning opportunities. This chapter teaches that accountability is also a catalyst for motivation and identity reinforcement, because when your actions are observed and tracked, you naturally align behavior with the person you aspire to be, and the fear of letting yourself or others down strengthens internal commitment, bridges the gap between standards and practice, and creates consistency where mere intention cannot. The most powerful form of accountability combines external observation with internal reflection, creating a dual system where standards are reinforced both socially and personally, because visibility amplifies effort, feedback strengthens learning, and internalization ensures long-term sustainability, making disciplined action inevitable rather than optional. This chapter also clarifies that accountability is not a crutch but a multiplier, not a replacement for internal standards, but an enhancer, because the disciplined person leverages it to maintain rigor, track progress, and adjust course without surrendering autonomy, and the result is a life where consistency is no longer dependent solely on emotion, willpower, or fleeting motivation, but supported by a system that reinforces action, monitors deviation, and accelerates alignment between behavior, identity, and goals. In essence, accountability turns discipline into a tangible, measurable, and enforceable practice, creating clarity, reducing rationalization, and ensuring that progress is maintained even when conditions are imperfect. And mastering this principle allows you to act predictably, consistently, and powerfully, transforming intention into action, potential into achievement, and effort into results, because accountability connects behavior to standards in a way that sustains discipline, strengthens identity, and compounds success over time. As HER50s, mastering the art of self-discipline is not the result of knowledge, motivation, or occasional bursts of effort. It is the culmination of all the habits, systems, mindsets, and choices you have developed and reinforced over time. And this final chapter exists to show you how to integrate everything you have learned into a coherent, unstoppable approach to life, because true discipline is not a skill you use occasionally, it is an identity you embody consistently, shaping every decision, action, and response to align with long-term goals, values, and standards. And once you internalize this, discipline ceases to feel like a battle and becomes the natural default state of your existence. Disciplined individuals understand that every aspect of their life, routines, environment, mindset, responses to failure, delayed gratification, accountability, and consistency is intentionally structured to minimize reliance on willpower and motivation, because willpower is finite, emotion is fleeting, and circumstances are unpredictable. But well-designed systems, reinforced identity, and ingrained habits create automatic action, predictable results, and unshakable progress regardless of conditions. This chapter emphasizes that mastery of discipline is holistic, meaning that no single strategy, habit, or principle is sufficient on its own, because each component supports the others, and neglecting one area weakens the entire framework, which is why the disciplined person continually refines their environment, enforces non-negotiable rules, prioritizes long-term gain over immediate pleasure, recovers quickly from failure, practices consistency, and leverages accountability, creating a compounding effect that accelerates growth, strengthens self-trust, and solidifies identity. Most people fail to achieve lasting discipline because they treat it as a series of tasks or goals rather than an integrated system, focusing on isolated actions instead of building the structures that enforce behavior. And when motivation wanes, fatigue sets in, or distractions arise, their efforts crumble. But the disciplined individual anticipates these challenges and designs life in such a way that action is inevitable, even under pressure, emotional fluctuation, or discomfort. This chapter teaches that the ultimate purpose of discipline is not simply to accomplish tasks or achieve external success, but to create a life in which your actions are aligned with your values, your identity is reinforced daily, and your decisions consistently reflect the person you aspire to become. Because when discipline is internalized as identity, effort becomes automatic, resistance becomes manageable, and excellence becomes habitual rather than exceptional. Mastering self-discipline also requires understanding that it is a lifelong process, not a destination, because conditions, goals, and personal growth evolve over time, and the individual who stops refining habits, updating systems, and challenging comfort inevitably declines, while the person who continuously integrates new lessons, reinforces standards, and adapts to changing circumstances strengthens momentum, maintains resilience, and ensures that discipline remains the default mode of operation across every area of life. This chapter reinforces that discipline is cultivated through deliberate practice, repetition, and reflection, because every action either reinforces or undermines identity, and only by consciously designing life to prioritize consistent, intentional action can you ensure that small choices accumulate into extraordinary results, creating the compounding effect that turns ordinary effort into remarkable achievement. Habitual excellence and unwavering self-control. The disciplined person understands that setbacks, failures, and discomfort are inevitable, but by mastering recovery, maintaining rules, leveraging accountability, and prioritizing long-term gains over immediate gratification, these challenges become tools for growth rather than obstacles, and each challenge met reinforces the mental frameworks, habits, and identity that support sustainable discipline, making action predictable, effort habitual, and results inevitable. This chapter also emphasizes the importance of integrating all previous lessons into daily life, creating synergy between mindset, environment, rules, accountability, identity, and consistency, because discipline does not thrive in isolation, and the more these elements are aligned, the less effort, negotiation, or motivation is required to act, and the more automatic, powerful, and reliable your behavior becomes. Ultimately, mastery of self-discipline transforms not only what you do, but who you are, because every choice to act in alignment with standards, values, and long-term goals reinforces identity, strengthens self-trust, and compounds confidence, creating a feedback loop in which disciplined action becomes effortless, natural, and self-sustaining. This chapter teaches that the journey of discipline is continuous, requiring daily commitment, reflection, and refinement, but by embracing the principles of non-negotiable rules, consistency, sacrifice, accountability, fast recovery, and identity-based action, you create a life in which excellence is inevitable, failure is temporary, and effort is rewarded with growth, results, and self-respect. Because mastery of self-discipline is not simply about controlling behavior, it is about designing life in such a way that disciplined action flows naturally, effortlessly, and predictably, shaping every aspect of existence toward the person you are becoming, the goals you are pursuing, and the legacy you will leave. And when this integration is achieved, discipline is no longer a challenge, it is a lifestyle and identity, and a force that propels you forward in every situation, under any circumstance, and across every area of life, creating unstoppable momentum, unshakable confidence, and the power to achieve anything you set your mind to.